last talk of today is by John Doyle. John sort of was born on the campus of Caltech, and he's still there. So he is really like a Caltech person. And I met John at a workshop in Santa Barbara about brain architecture and so on. And what John brought into that discussion was his view coming more from control engineering, which it was extremely appealing to me, and I think also very relevant for understanding of the brain, including if we think about these complex phenomena like consciousness, because if we think about this tight coupling of the brain and the body, in the end, what we're talking about is control. And then you see that within neuroscience, there have been some attempts to phrase answers around questions of what the brain does in terms of control, but it has been rather limited to very specialized little domains. And I think John has made a great progress, great strides in trying to come to a more elaborate, inclusive, global view on how we can think about brains as control systems. And in John's mind, this also will generalize then to many other systems, like the future of the architecture of the internet and many other things. So it's absolutely fantastic that you're here, John. So I'm looking forward to your talk. So
thank you.
Go for it. Control us.
Thank you. So thank you. Two amazing talks this morning. Wow. And a lot of subtleties. I'm aiming for no subtleties. I'm interested in the most obvious behaviors, like how the hell can we do this, right? And this is a sort of a very pretentious title. And so I'm going to focus on brains, but I'm really interested in complex networks of all types. You might ask me about synesthesia, but I won't talk about synesthesia. That's a really interesting topic. But also, what I have online is a bunch of videos that go through this in a little bit slower. So think of this as like a preliminary or a preview of the videos. And I'll try to keep us on time. Okay, so I'm interested in these major transitions. And these are obviously transitions in evolution, but they're also big changes in architecture. And so often it's convenient to sit on one side or another of these rather than study how these happened. And they're all increases in complexity in some sense, but also elaboration of networks. But those are the four most confused topics in all of science. And the engineers who really understand it basically refuse to tell you how things work. They want you to buy what they make, but they won't tell you how it works. So we got a problem, and we're trying to bridge that. And one of the problems is the theoretical foundations have become very fragmented. These are all important areas that tend not to talk to each other. And at least at Caltech, we're trying to make them one subject, not all a bunch of subjects. It could be a foundation for this. And I'm not going to tell you about that. I'm going to tell you what the motivation for it is. And the other way of thinking about this is that if you buy this DAC theory, which I kind of like, then what's the mathematics that would go behind this? And when I say theory, I have a much narrower notion of theory, and it's probably parochial, right? It means what theorems can you prove? That's a very parochial view, and I admit to that. Okay, so, and what I like about brains is and I think of them as doing two things: sensory motor control and maintaining homeostasis, and not so much about cognition and all that stuff. I think that's overrated. I also think we're way too eukaryocentric. But anyway, but they're complex or informative. We can do live demos. We're going to do live demos, and everybody's interested in it. So if you can motivate your theories with brains, you're going to get a lot more interest. And so I'm going to focus on, not all of these, but I'm going to focus on bipedalism and balance here, connect it a little bit up to cells and technologies, and look at these kind of trade-offs. And I'll try to explain what these universal laws and architectures are in terms of pictures like this, cartoons really, and focus to begin with on bipedalism. So first of all, we'd like to be both robust and very efficient, but usually there are trade-offs. So if you compare us with chimps, we're about 4 times as fast at, say, marathon distance running. And if you add a bike, you get another factor of 2. But a lot more fragile than chimps, and the bikes make the crashes worse. And so that's Paul on the left, and that's me over on the right. Anyway, so there's these real trade-offs, and these are the kind of, I think, these are some of the most fundamental trade-offs that drive engineering design, and I think evolution as well. But we're going to finesse the efficiency, and you'll see how I do that in the brain situation, because I want to try to focus in on the robustness a little bit more and not the robustness efficiency trade-off, even though I think that's the most important thing, because I think there's really interesting things to look at along this axis. And so in the world of robust efficiency, here's a paper that I hope you'll read. Nobody reads this paper. It's very makes me unhappy. It's about robust efficiency in maintaining homeostasis. Why is there heart rate variability and so on? But I'm not going to talk about that today. What I want to do is I want to expand this notion of robustness and fragility some. Now, if we really wanted to look at all the dimensions of kind of complex systems and stuff, these are all the trade-offs. These are all meaningful. I'm going to not do all these, but I'm going to kind of lump them into robustness, efficiency, and simplicity. But then I'm going to really look at this trade-off, speed and flexibility. We'd like to be fast, flexible, and accurate. These are not the same. I'm projecting them into a low dimension again because PowerPoint slides are two-dimensional. And so I'm going to force myself to fit everything into that picture. Okay, and so I'm going to look at balance, vision, planning, and reflexes kind of again in this picture. Okay, so again, how can humans do this? First of all, we've got a trail and we've got bumps. Kind of two things happening simultaneously. And we have higher level planning to deal with the trail is going all over the place. The bumps are quite a bit smaller, but they can be catastrophic, and we deal with them with lower levels and reflexes. So we have separate parts of our brain that deal with these two problems, and we do them simultaneously extremely well. It also illustrates tool use because the type of bike you're riding here can make an enormous difference. So if you have a really nicely suspended bike, which is a completely passive mechanism, it's much easier to ride this. So I'd love to talk about the relationship between passive and active mechanisms because that's really interesting, but I'm not going to. I'm going to focus on the active parts. So what we build is actually this little, I'm not an experimentalist at all, but I dabble in it once in a while. So particularly when there's a big hole in a subject, it's easy to do experiments because there's no experts there. So here's an experiment where we've been able to replicate that in some ways. You get bumps by having a steering wheel with a force feedback that kicks you around, and then you have to follow a trail here. So that scrolls down, and you have to turn to try to keep where you are on this line. So this is a big error. You should be on top of this, but then you have to keep going back as this scrolls down. And what you can play all sorts of games with how the person interacts with this. And so I'll show you a little bit. I won't spend a lot of time on it because it fits the theory I tell you about perfectly, and so there's not much to say about it. But so when you have a trail, so what's the problem here? Is you have to make a plan using vision, and then you have lots of advanced warning. You're seeing way ahead, and the disturbances are huge, right? The fluctuations you're having to track are enormous, and we do that kind of stuff quite well. Just a few days ago, I was in California, and I was able, with enough resources and time, to come enormous distances and be right here. Right? So we can give an advanced warning and stuff. We can do these amazing things. And that's just part of the problem. Very large disturbances, very small errors as a consequence if we have enough advanced warning. On the other hand, along the way, we encounter bumps, and completely different. Delayed, we find out about the bump after we've hit it. We have to react with reflexes, and quite small disturbances can create enormously large errors. And so that's this part. And so there's this extreme diversity in our behaviors, yet we are able to, in fact, because of that in some sense, we're able to multiplex these two tasks really well. You wouldn't want to add texting to this. So there's some things that we don't multiplex well, and we've exhaustively studied the things we don't multiplex well, but this is an instance of something we do extremely well. It's apparently less studied. So what I want to do is, of course, we can't, I could have brought the game and had everybody try the game. We're going to do a live demo with you to try to illustrate this. And again, to those of you who are into neuroscience know what I'm going to tell you a lot better than I do, but I'll go ahead and do it anyway. So we want to look at some architectural issues, and we're going to try to make some sense of that block diagram in the upper right. Okay, so here's the experiment. I want you to watch this and read the text. So between 2 and 3 hertz, it gets pretty hard to read. And it's very easy up here. okay? And this thing is aliasing a little bit, so if you had a higher frame rate, it actually would be harder to see. Now I want you to do the following experiment. I want you to shake your head as fast as you can. Not big, fast, okay? So if you shake your head, no matter how hard, how fast you shake your head, you can still read. That's more like 10 hertz. And you can do them together. So you can shake your head and read this text up here just about as well as if you don't shake your head. So you can, you're really good at dealing with head shaking, and you're really good at multiplexing head shaking with the regular tracking with your eye. Okay, how does that work? Okay, so what happens is object motion you're slow with respect to, and this you're fast with. Why and how does this work? Okay, and this is kind of analogous to the higher level planning using vision, and this is a reflex. This is literally a reflex, and we'll see about how that works. Okay, so there's this trade-off. With respect to objects, you're flexible and accurate, but slow. So flexible, actually, your vision didn't evolve to read PowerPoint slides, yet you're using it to do that, right? So you're really good at this, but quite slow. And then over here, with respect to head motion, you're fast, but relatively flexible, and we're gonna see that the system that does that is also quite inaccurate, but fast. Okay, want to see that. Okay, so you know how this works. This is just vision, and it moves your eye muscles through the cortex. It's got a big delay, 200 to 300 milliseconds. For this system, you got the VOR system in your head, which is basically a bunch of, for the engineers, kind of rate gyros in your head. It does not use vision, doesn't go through the brain at all. It goes directly, wires directly at it. This is one of the fastest reflexes in the body, tens of milliseconds. So this is kind of a minimal cartoon about how those two things work. And then here's the mechanism, and here's the trade-off. So you got this trade-off. You have this system, you have this system, they work together. And why do you need that? If this is your lifestyle, object motions are relatively slow in the rates they produce. But if you're chasing after it, you're bobbing up and down. And because you don't have a gimbaled head because you're upright, then you need this VOR system. You have to have this, or you can't be the top predator. And it's not just us. They have to be able to see in the distance and track, but once they catch their prey, they better be quick. And I don't want to, shouldn't be just about violence. You can have nonviolent activities, and it's not just vision, it's smell. So it's a lot of other things, but I'm going to focus on this. So the idea is, this is kind of the picture, but if you're a control engineer, you go, well, that can't possibly work, because those two signals have to match, and there's no way you can encode that genetically, right? And so you need a gain somewhere to tune it, and you have, of course, the usual guy in there, the cerebellum doing the tuning. And it's a little piece of the cerebellum. But it also uses this auxiliary optical system that bypasses the cortex, which is quite interesting. So it's getting a signal from your eye, but it's using it to do this tuning. And I just told you everything I know about AOS. I don't really know much about it or how it works. So what you got is this little guy, this vestibular nuclei that this passes through pretty fast. This is a fast path, tens of milliseconds, hundreds of milliseconds. And then there's this little guy tuning it to keep those matched. And you can mess this up, put on prism glasses and all sorts of stuff, and you're a little weird for a while. And then after a few hours or days, you're back on, and then you take them off, and it's weird for a while. But I think it gets so that you can take them on and off, and you adapt much more quickly. But again, I don't know the details of that. So you got this trade-off, right? You got vision sitting up here, slow, flexible but slow. You've got reflexes down here, and then you actually got this tuning mechanism, which is way up here. So a lot of times our tuning and learning mechanisms, they're tuning these systems down here, but they can be quite slow, even the slowest of even slower than vision. Okay. Now what's interesting is this vestibular nuclei is connected to all sorts of stuff. Now the fact that it's connected to muscles and balance is pretty obvious. That's necessary. But why is it connected to the GI tract and all this diaphragm and vomiting stuff, right? That's why you have motion sickness. That sure looks like a bug if I've ever seen one, right? But maybe not. It's a really sensitive sensor. And so at one time, the conjecture is that this was your most sensitive sensor for toxins. So if you've ingested a toxin, before you know anything else, you will get dizzy. Exactly with this mechanism. And what do you want to do then? You want to throw up right away. You don't want to wait around to see if anything else happens. Like, do you get paralyzed? You don't want to wait to that, right? And so it may have been a feature. But now you put us in a modern environment where you can have a mismatch here due to mechanical stuff. You're sitting in a boat, you're riding an airplane, in a car. completely not there when you're hunter-gatherer, right? And all of a sudden, this feature becomes a bug. And we haven't evolved around it yet, apparently. So, okay. Anyway, but balance is really important. So it connects up with all this balance. And let me just say a little something about this. Again, very naive view of this. But the idea is that you really have three systems. You've got vision, VOR, and proprioception. And so we can play around with those a little bit. Again, if we had more time, I'd have you all stand up and do the experiments. But you can do these experiments anytime. And I'll demo them. So, and I would probably be more dramatic at demo than you are because I'm old and feeble and have had a lot of concussions. So anyway, we can see what happens to our ability to balance when we shut off vision. Not a lot. Right? It's not too bad. I can still move around. Now I'm going to start bumping into things, right? But basic balance is not disrupted all that much, it would seem. I can also, I'm not going to disable this, but I can degrade it by standing in one leg. So now I have poor proprioception and poor actuation. It's actually the actuation that's the bigger issue, so I'm kind of cheating here a little bit. But I can stand up on one leg. I can even hop around somewhat, right? Okay. But what happens if I take both of these out and rely just on my VOR system? Not so good. Okay, I fall over. And again, if you're young and haven't had a lot of brain damage like I have, some of you will be able to stand. I have one of my students can just stand indefinitely. But she's like 18 or 19. And she does martial arts. So she goes, oh. Anyway, but for me, when I have to rely on the VOR system, and you can try this later, try it yourself. If I've just got the VOR system, it's got big errors. So this fast system is pretty inaccurate, okay? But, boy, if you lose the VOR system, you're toast. You can't do anything. And you can experiment around with, this is easily, you can easily affect this through drinking various things, and you might try this out tonight. Yeah. And so when you get dizzy and you start falling over, it's because of this. Okay, the other thing we want to do is you also have to have these sensors in your head. If you had these sensors down here, it wouldn't work. Why is that? Maybe I'm going to talk about it now. No, that'll come up later. I'm not sure I'm going to have time for it. But you need to if you put that VOR sensor anywhere else, it wouldn't work, which is kind of cool. It's a good thing that it was in our head to begin with, right? So we could co-opt it for this purpose. So we got these trade-offs, right? So we got these trade-offs, and we've got this architecture up here. So this is a special case, and the idea is that you have this speed flexibility trade-off, and of course accuracy as well. But what I want to focus on a little bit is flexibility, because what I mean by a law is that there's only certain components you can build, and this isn't quite the same as a physical law. It's more like an engineering law. And the idea is that, but I think you could more or less from first principles say, this is what you can build on the neural components. And ideally you'd be down there, but the idea is that you can't. You can only build parts that lie above this curve. And what a good architecture allows, what does architecture mean? It means that you can build anything that the law sort of allows for. So you can build stuff all along here, and we do, right? We have things all along this curve. But it also does something else. It tunes the system so you have the illusion that you're fast and flexible. Before we did this experiment, you didn't even know that you had all this stuff, right? You just thought you were fast and flexible and accurate. But you weren't really. You really had this system. And now, we do this all the time, right? So we'd like memories here that would be fast, large, and cheap, right? Everybody would love to have fast, large, and cheap. But there is no such memory, right? There's memories that lie in this curve. Now, Moore's law, which is a completely different notion, is constantly moving this curve down. But at any time, you're stuck with these technologies. But what do? Well, we build these things, and this is one of the most important ideas in this whole talk is virtualization. So what we do is we organize this architecture, and again, if you know about how this works, you get this virtualization, which makes it appear as though you have fast, large, and cheap memory. I mean, ridiculously cheap now, what memory is, right? But now you could say it's an illusion, or as you could say it's an abstraction, but I think the right term, or those are all good terms, but virtualization is a more precise term, I think, for this. And we do this all the time. But did I contradict myself? I said there's a law here, and then I said, okay, but we can violate it with a good architecture. We don't really violate it. There's other dimensions, remember, and in other dimensions, you're killing yourself. So for example, you're really good at this, but you're lousy at that. So you can't do this very well. Once you're, like if you put your hand in front of your face, it blurs at 2 hertz, right? Of course, there's no selective pressure to do this. It doesn't matter. What matters is these other tasks. Okay, so there's a trade-off. So what you want to do is you want the architecture, same with the virtual memories, right? If you put the exactly right memory references in there and you know the architecture, you can make it behave terribly. It's very unlikely for that to happen in your ordinary use of your computer. So you always have these fragilities, but you try to put them in a place that the environment doesn't hit you with. So that's our sensory motor story. What we're going to try to get to is how that is dependent on the hardware. So we want to, that's the most of this talk is about how it connects with the hardware. And what we see is that we have this extreme heterogeneity, which I'll talk about in the hardware, but also notice that we have this extreme heterogeneity in our behavior, right? Our behavior, we've got this advanced planning and stuff that's very different than the reflexes. And the problem is, and again, in the kind of the context when I got interested in neuroscience just a few years ago, those people won't talk to each other very much. Yet these are some of the biggest, most obvious questions is how does this hardware relate to these applications? How does this extreme diversity here connect with extreme diversity there? And if you ask people who actually know this stuff, they know a ton about it. But it's something that's kind of informal. So I was going to try to formalize it and try to put some math behind it. So extremely different, diverse and different. So what we're going to look at is look a little bit at the hardware now, okay? And this is collaborations with Simon Laughlin at Cambridge and Terry Sosnowski at Salk and UCSD. You probably know them. I'll probably screw up the story, but it's all kind of due to them and my iteration with them on what the trade-offs are. So we're going to avoid the efficiency trade-off by taking the following assumption. Basically, we're going to take the neuroanatomy as given. So the distances are fixed by the need to innervate a nerve or a sensor, right? So that's fixed. But what we're going to imagine is possibly variable is the cross-sectional area, which is, so we got nerves, which are bundles of axons. And the idea is that the cost is about proportional, given the length is fixed, is proportional to the area, okay? And what I mean by cost, you have to build this thing, and you have to maintain it once it's built. And the cool thing is roughly speaking, both of those costs scale about like the area. So we get really lucky here that we can make a simple model for the efficiency. And then we're going to really cheat. We're going to look at a bunch of nerves that are all the same area, roughly. So I'm completely cheating on the whole efficiency thing to make things simple, okay? And we're going to look at these cranial nerves and some similar to that as diverse links, diverse composition. And also, these are potentially sort of bottlenecks, and I think you can make the case for that for at least a few of these. So what do these look like? I'm going to look at the mean axon diameter versus the axons per nerve. And for more or less, they're about the same. And so if you had a fixed area on this curve, because I'm looking at axons per nerve and mean axon diameter, a fixed area would be a curve that looks like that, okay, or a line like that, okay? And there's where optic is, about a micron. Again, there's some spread in it. I'm ignoring the spread for now. And there's about 1 million, roughly. Much bigger, many fewer. Okay. Auditory kind of sits in between. Olfactory is not on the curve. It's smaller, overall smaller, but there's a lot of them. And if this was a bloodhound, there'd be not 6 million, but 100 million, and a lot bigger. But in us, we don't seem to be devoting as much resources to olfaction as we do to vision. Spinal down here, the sciatic nerve, the thing that makes you, this hurts, okay? That's way down here, and then there's some peripheral nerves like that are even singletons. I'm not going to worry too much about that. I'm going to mostly focus on these guys up here. So there's 4 orders of magnitude just looking in these cranial and spinal nerves. Huge, huge variability, even though they're roughly the same size. Now, actually, I'm not interested in this anatomy. I'm interested in the functionality of this. So what I want to get back to is this speed-accuracy trade-off at the hardware level, right? So I'm going to plot 1 over the bandwidth. This is a log-log plot, bits per unit time on these nerves, versus the delay, the latency in propagation down the nerve. Okay, that's the trade-off. And just empirically, what does this look like? Well, according to Simon and Terry, it looks roughly like that. It looks like the bandwidth scales with a delay, and that proportionality of constant just depends on the cross-sectional area. Okay. And so we're going to adopt that model for this trade-off. So we have a hardware trade-off in speed accuracy. And olfaction isn't on the curve. Again, it's less resources. So here's the idea. Suppose I just had one big bit. I'd be fast, but big error, but I'd have low delay. That's one scenario. And that's these guys up here. Of course, they don't have 1 bit, they have a lot more, but, and then you could go with high bandwidth. So you get a lot of accuracy, but you're slow, you have a big delay. Okay, that's these guys. And what does that look like? Well, everything's delayed and quantized, so you can have a low delay. So I'm taking either 1 axon or 3 with the same total cross-sectional area and high bandwidth, and you get these square roots of 3, and it sort of looks like this. These guys are going faster, these guys are going slower, and they're also being sent slower, but there's more of them, so you get more bits but bigger delay. And that's the trade-off. Now, nothing I say after this really depends crucially on it, but it does simplify things. But you could plug in some other relationship if you really liked it. Okay. Every technology has some curve associated with it. Okay, we're going to take this particular curve. So we're going to take this one, and then we're going to, we want a theory that lets us plug in these details. Okay, so I want to explain this theory that includes all these details. So how do I get this picture in? So I'm going to take, again, I'm going to really pick something that is as simple as possible. And I'm going to skip the math, but the math up for the next part of the story is literally high school algebra. And I'll try to give you some intuition why we think. So imagine we got this block diagram. We got 2 computers, something higher level in planning and something lower level and reflexive. And then we have sensing and actuation and communication, and everything can be delayed and quantized. So you're computing everything. Okay, so here's a kind of picture we're going to look at. We're going to imagine that we've got delays and we've got quantization. And in principle, we have that all over the place. So we're going to say, oh, there's kind of a bottleneck nerve, and we're going to focus on one bottleneck nerve. Okay, so that's the picture we're going to look at. We've got 2 things. Here's our plant. Here's us bumping along. And we got the bumps hitting us. And we also have a trail that hits us, but we have advanced warning for that. So this is an advanced warning because it's a delay in the environment. That helps us. And then there's our delay internally here, and that hurts us. And there's a trade-off between the look ahead and our internal delay. So that's the picture we want to look at. And it turns out we can study bumps only and trails only by themselves. So in our experiment, we can have the bumps on a straight trail, or we can have no bumps on the trail, or we can have the bumps on the trail together. And you can imagine doing that out on the mountain to some extent. Okay. And there's no stochastics here at all. It's all worst case. This again simplifies the math. It doesn't mean you have to do it this way. But the point is, I think it's natural here. I don't care about the integral square error of my error on the. I don't want to crash, right? So because if I stay on it for a long time and then go off a little bit, right, or go off too much, my integral square error is small, but I just died. What I care about is not hitting this, not going off the track. So I really care about this quantity, the worst thing that can happen over time, given a certain amount of turns and given a certain size bumps. Okay, and so this is what we'd call extreme risk sensitivity. It turns out again, if you want to put some stochastics on top of this, it's no big deal. It's just that it's not high school algebra anymore because you actually have to teach kids what a stochastic process is. But you can teach this to high school kids. I don't know why I care about teaching high school kids. I even don't talk to undergrads, but I want to make this simple, right? I'm trying to get this simple as a first step in bridging the gap between this. So here's the cool thing. If you take this problem, and this is a formula that you can derive, again, high school algebra. We'll take a simple version of it and try to give you intuition. The combined problem just splits into the sum of the 2. So the theory says, if you have this architecture, that is, you actually have separate parts of your brain for doing these 2 problems, the optimal strategy involves you actually being able to do these 2 tasks together, just the sum of them doing separately. They don't interfere. and experimentally, that's true. So the theory matched the experiments, again, more or less perfectly in the sense that we do have two parts of our brain. And if you have separate parts of the brain, you ought to be able to do these tasks simultaneously together, just like you can sort of walk and talk at the same time. So the errors add, that's kind of the key idea in this step of the thing. And again, everything I've done up to this point has been carefully cooked up so that this is true. Right? We've chosen a task, this bumps and trails, which we do really well together. We've made all the assumptions in the underlying story. We picked parts of the brain. Everything we've done is so that this story works out. If you don't make those separate choices, the story still works. It's just the math is not high school anymore. Now it's all of a sudden it leaps into graduate level stuff, and it's not easy to teach to anybody. So I'm going to take a special case where I'll show you what this means. So the idea is that, actually, I'll come back to this. I don't want to spend too much time. Yeah, we're going to run out of time. Okay, so the errors add. And let me tell you what the model is. It's just the simple model. So the idea is that in this, certainly in our game, there's so much damping in these motors that there's almost no inertia. So basically what happens is the dynamics are just scalar and simple. So what happens is the next time instant of the position is just how much torque we put on the motor, or how much torque we put. And then this is the error in where we are on the track, okay? So it's a really simple first order system. Is it really? No, of course not. It's got all this backlash and all this kind of stuff, but it's not it actually works out pretty well to do this. And again, it would just make the math harder if we had to put all that other stuff in there. And then the idea is that if I say, what's the best I can do with my controller, and I'm going to use my R bits as smart as I can, but I'm going to have this worst case trail that I'm tracking, how big is my error? And that's the formula. And let me see if I can sort of give you some intuition why that might be true. If I have R bits, I get 2 to the R levels that I can encode. So my error is basically going to be 2 to the minus R. And what's my optimal controller? Well, I'm just going to cancel this. I'm going to try to make the error 0 with the advanced warning and the error I just had. So if you just do a little algebra, you get this. Okay. So it looks like it's kind of a little tweak on static rate distortion theory, if you know what that means. If you don't, it doesn't matter. But anyway, you get a very simple formula. And then what happens on this side is now you have a bump. No advanced warning, it just hits you, but you have delay. So you have quantization and delay, and this delay is getting you now. So it turns out, but again, this formula is very simple. It just adds up. You get the delay plus this term that's due to the bits errors. Okay, and that's this picture. So the idea is, what is going on here? Well, this is the torque on the motor. So if you don't do anything and you torque the motor, it just goes, it just keeps turning until it hits the stop. But you have to then compensate for that torque, but you do it after it's happened. So what ends up, when you're sitting here doing it, it's going like this. It goes, and then you try to stop it, and then you pull it back. Of course, then we have a program to go the other way, and it goes back and forth, and it's actually kind of tiring, but. And also, now the W is much smaller. It has to be a lot smaller than the trail. And we use different parts of our brains for these two parts of the system, okay? And so how does the theory work out? This is a student, Yori Nakahira, who did most of this work. So now the question is, how do we play in this? We have a framework for doing this that lets us have delay and quantization in the theory, and then we have a quantization delay trade-off in the hardware, plug it in, okay? So we're going to take this special case where we get this very simple formula, delay plus quantization effect. And then we plug in our nerve model. Very simple, right? So what do you get then? Well, you get a total cost, which has a cost due to delay. That just grows with the delay. You have a cost due to quantization that goes down with delay, because if you allow more delay, you get more bits. And then there's a sweet spot in the middle, and that would depend on the problem. Where would you want to be in that sweet spot? Okay. So again, we're going to take advantage of our simple picture to say we can now. This separates in two ways. First of all, the total problem does just separate in these, and they add up. But then we can put these both together by having either we're going to say, here's our advanced warning, and here's our internal quantization and delay. And as long as this is bigger than this, then we have advanced warning, okay? Over here, we're going to say, oh, we have the rest of our nervous system has some delay in it, and we're going to focus on this nerve, which has extra delay. This delay is hurting us. And so I'm going to call this minus tau for a delay, and this is going to be tau for advance, so that I can put them on the same plot. So now what happens is I can write a single formula that includes both this side and plot it. Hopefully this will get clear. This is kind of a mess, so we're going to take it piece by piece. Okay. And the ideal thing is we'd like to be way down in this corner, but there's these hard trade-offs that we can't get past. So what's going on over here? This is when you have advanced warning. Okay. And the idea is that when you have advanced warning, the cost is dominated by quantization cost, by accuracy. And it also, the more advanced warning you have, if you had an optimal system for that advanced warning, you can make the error 0, which is what we do with technology when we have the advanced warning. So I can, like I said, I can use advanced technology to go from Los Angeles to Barcelona. It takes me a day or two, but I have plenty of time. And I can reduce the error by, if there was a needle here and I had a thread, I could thread the needle. I mean, we could just make it arbitrarily small. So technology we can do way over here, right? Make the error arbitrarily small. And what happens is the bandwidth and the delay increase optimally, okay? Now, of course, we don't have that in our brains. We do some places. Given large enough bandwidth, it can be very robust. The other extreme happens over here, the delayed system. If you have a large delay, then the delay cost dominates. But what's interesting is these are both low, both the bandwidth and the delay low, but they don't depend on the delay now. So these are pretty fixed. So the idea is that this is interesting because it says that, again, in this very simplified theory, your reflexes don't depend on the details of the tasks you're doing. There's a sort of optimal thing to be putting into your reflexes. I'm not sure how seriously to take that, but when delay is large, a system is just very fragile. So what you get is this picture, which is the trade-off. Okay. So again, you get this extreme diversity, but it makes sense. The extreme diversity that we saw in the hardware is directly connected to the extreme diversity we see in our behavior. They match up really nicely, right? So you have this part of the system, the lower level reflexes, that correspond to this toy model, which corresponds to this end, right? And so large delay cost dominates, cost goes to infinity. Bandwidth and delay are both low down here. So you have low delay and low bandwidth. Here's just the opposite, right? Down here, high delay, high bandwidth, and the quantization cost dominates. So these extremes that we see both in the behavior and in the physiology. And again, you go to talk to a neurologist about this, who's maybe a mountain biker. And they know this, right? I mean, they could tell you this story, but without any math and without any scientist ever talked to, because nobody does research on this, as far as I can tell. I could be wrong, tell me if I'm wrong. But these kind of questions are really more medical in the current milieu than they are scientific. High bandwidth and delay, okay. And so we're connecting mechanistic physiology with these systems level things, which was our objective. And again, up till now, high school math. So we've gotten by with a few things. The errors add in this case. In general, they don't, quite as simply as this. And we obviously, in lots of tasks that we would do, that errors don't add at all. Again, texting and driving, they don't add. Because we use different parts of our brain, that's how we can do it. So what experiments can we do on this? Well, one of the things we can do is we can take the trail only and give them less warning. In fact, no advanced warning. And this is the raw data, but this is the summary, which says, here's what the theory says. We go at this part of the picture. So the theory says, up past where your internal delay is, it doesn't matter how much advanced warning you have. And then around 300 milliseconds, your error goes up linearly with the amount of deficit you have in advanced warning. And here is 0. So here's when you have no advanced warning at all. But here you're seeing the past. You're sort of driving with your rearview mirror. Not so good. And it just keeps getting worse like this. And it depends on which norm you use to measure that, but it's this linear thing. So that's the first prediction of the theory, and it fits the data so far. Although it's like we have a very low n, so maybe this is this person it fit. So we haven't yet done the large n studies that we probably should do. Okay, so that fits really well.
But John, there's something I don't understand here, because in
Yeah.
some sense you would expect if the advance warning is after the event, so it's actually not informative, then the impact should be sort of flat.
No,
But you don't
no, because it's better. Here's no advance warning. That's a hell of a lot easier than that. Way easier. So as that goes back, it just gets worse and worse, and it gets worse linearly.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, that's what the theory says, and that's what the experiment says. But that's a good question. Okay, the next thing we can do is we can now put the two together. So this is trails only, and the brown is the driver, and the black, so they're doing pretty well. And so this is the error they produce. And then we can look at just bumps only, so they're on a straight line, just getting bumped around. And we've chosen these so that they're roughly the same size, so we can meaningfully add them up. And then it's here together, so let's expand this. So the green line is them together. Now, it's not that the signals add, right, because the signals don't add. It's that the errors are approximately additive, right? So the green didn't get a lot worse. It's roughly as big as the two together, okay? So people are, again, this is one of the persons who actually kind of helped develop or he supervised the undergrad who was developing the game, so he got to do it a lot, so he's pretty good. But and actually when you start out, you're all over the map, but within minutes, like 20 to 30 minutes of playing this game, you're locked into this pretty good score, okay? So again, it fits pretty well. I don't know what this is, the same thing. Okay. Okay, so what we got is that we got this extreme diversity, and we sort of have an integrated theory that connects these. Okay, how am I doing on time? Okay. Let me just go back to this. So now we can take this theory and ask a question like, why do you need to have the VOR system in your head? And so instead of balancing bodies, we're going to do balancing sticks for a minute. And again, this is a good it's a good demo if you do it, but I'm going to do it because there's a lot of you and it would take a long time. So here's the deal. This is well known, that if I make the stick shorter, it gets harder. So not hard, not hard. Not too bad, a little harder. Really hard. And also, why am I oscillating? That's another thing the theory predicts. Okay, it gets harder, and then eventually it's like, I can't do it. Okay. That's not what's interesting. It's not new, but again, in a lot of literature on this, right? A lot of people wrote papers on this, but no one ever did this experiment, apparently. And the theory tells you exactly what will happen. Is that I make it really easy, but I look at them down and occlude my peripheral vision, it's impossible. So it's much harder. This is harder than this. So I take the same looking place and make that long. So this is much more stable. So again, this comes right out of the theory. But the idea is that you wouldn't want to put your VOR system in the middle. It wouldn't work for this reason. And there's a bunch of theory. And there's a little theorem down here in the corner. And I have a bunch of videos on this. So lots of videos on this online. And this is also why, same reason that glycolysis oscillates. I mean, you may have heard this, that cells will spontaneously go into oscillations for no reason, apparently. And it's just this phenomena, the fact that this oscillates. So the oscillation, why is it bad when you look down, all that stuff, that's more undergrad math, but not bad. Yeah?
These intuitions are quite natural, and when we were dealing with self-balancing robots, we had the same one, but it turned out it's wrong. So you don't want the sensors up, you want them down on a self-balancing robot. Also, why these wheels balance so well if they have the inertia?
Oh, if you have the angle, you don't need anything else, right? If I have the angle, which I don't have here, if I have the angle, I have everything. So what you really want is the angle. That's the perfect thing to have. But if you don't have, but remember, my angle isn't so good, right? If I could really measure the angle, I wouldn't need anything else, right? So that's what you want to use in a robot. We just don't have that. But it's a great point. You're absolutely right. You want the angle, and the angle's at the bottom. So you got to be a little careful about this, right? You'd really like to have, You'd like to have an absolute angle sensor to the ground. That would be perfect, but we don't have one. But robots do. Okay. You have to be, and you have to be a little bit careful about being too biomimetic here because the problems are really pretty different. Anyways, this theorem, anyway. Okay. Now, where does the interesting math come in is when there's a billion boxes, right? Not just two. And here's where the math gets interesting. And so you've got computing, communication, and physics. So one of the things is that you've got, in real physics, you've got big networks. And I mean, I work at power grid and internet and cells. They all have this, and so do us. We're all distributed. But it's also sparse. So the physical world, physics, is sparsely connected, and you got to take advantage of that. So our bodies are our muscles and bones are very sparsely connected, and you got to take advantage of that. But these things are all distributed, sparse. Sometimes there's warnings, sometimes there's delays. It's all quantized, okay? And you have to have a theory that takes all that into account. So this would be kind of a cartoon version. You got cortex reflex. You've got some physical stuff down here. But again, billions of nodes. And so you have to be, polynomial time scalability is not good enough. You need order 1 scalability. So the big theory we've been working on is to get order 1 scalability for the stuff. And how do you do that? You do it through localization. So all our work now is how to use localization to get scalability. And it looks like biology works that way. And so the nice thing is this theory is matching up with the biology really well. That's not even undergraduate math at this point. But there will be videos on this by November online because I'm teaching a course on this. And so this will all be available. So I want to just finish up here a little bit. How are we doing? Yeah, okay. I have a little bit of time here. We talked about this system. And what I'm claiming is there's a bunch of universal features of these architectures. And so I want to run through pretty quickly, high-level, hand-wavy view, taking 2 other extreme examples. So we've got this picture. So there's a speed flexibility trade-off. There's an accuracy trade-off here, but I'm going to focus on flexibility versus speed. Same thing here. This is now the Linux OS kernel. And we could go through that as well. Just as if you want something to be fast, you better have it in reflexes. If you want something to be fast, you better have special purpose hardware. But the greatest flexibility comes by having the application software, right? So the flexibility in this machine is the fact that I can get lots of diverse applications. And that's where the flexibility comes. But all that stuff is slow. So the antenna here is not in software. That's got to be fast. It's got to be in hardware. Although we get software-defined radios and stuff. Bacterial cell, same story. If you're going to have to react to something quickly in the environment, you better have the proteins made. And we see an example of this in red blood cells, right? Red blood cells have a very special job to do. They have to squeeze through little small things. So all they have is proteins. They don't have any of this other stuff. But your greatest flexibility comes at this level, your ability to express genes and have proteins made just in time when they're needed. That gives you the greatest flexibility. But that's not the greatest flexibility. We'll see later what that really is. But these are incredibly different systems, obviously, completely different hardware, completely different environments. Yet I claim these universals are quite profound, and they're all what I'm going to call layered architectures. They use layering and virtualization. And I'm not going to have time to go into that in much detail, but I'll kind of give you the superficial fly-through, and then maybe that'll interest you in listening to the videos describe this. So we have all these universals that are present. So I'm just going to kind of go through these quickly, one at a time. And it's, again, it's going to be kind of fast, but hopefully you'll get a feel for it. Okay, so what do I mean by fast versus flexible? And what do I mean by this picture? Well, it's where do you do control? Do you do control in? And notice that apps have to run in hardware. So when I draw this picture, it's not like there isn't hardware down here. It's just, is there hardware plus apps, or is there just hardware? Is there protein plus gene expression, or just proteins? Okay. So there's 2 things. There's a trade-off and there's a mechanism. Okay. So let me see if I can, which one I'm going to. So the idea is that you have the main mechanism for accelerated evolvability is horizontal transfer, right? So sure, you can write your own code, but who does that anymore, right? You just download it. So if we look around this room, how many apps are on the different cell phones in this room? Thousands, different ones, right? We also do a bit of horizontal hardware transfer. Every once in a while, we get a new piece of hardware, and then we move our software over. right? Not quite as diverse. So if we looked around, how many different hardware platforms do we have here? Probably less than a dozen. How many operating systems here? Probably 1 or 2. They're all running kind of some version of Linux now. How many things in the internet are here? One thing, TCP/IP, everywhere, right? So diversity, diversity. So what you see is this horizontal transfer is the greatest source of flexibility in these systems, and the architecture explicitly supports it, right? So let's take genes, right? So, right, massive horizontal gene transfer. If you take, and this is out of date, 100 E. coli, there's about 4,000 genes per cell, but more than 20,000 genes, and this number's probably 100,000 now. And there's probably no upper bound on this, and that's just E. coli, right? Less than 1,000 universally cell and 300 about essential, right? This sort of picture is pretty ubiquitous. Same story, right? Massive horizontal transfer. And I have a bunch of stuff on this. This is heat shock. It's really a cool story because it uses the whole architecture. So I've written some papers on that. We're still working on it. One of the things that we have to do when we learn to do something is we have to put things in the right part of the architecture. And that's why I was sorry we didn't skip over the passive stuff, because getting a bike that has suspension on or having the ability to put the right impedance in your muscles, that's all passive, but it's tunable. And that's very cool. So you got to put stuff in the right layer. And there's the coolest story about baseball in this, if we had more time, about hitting and pitching and how you have to do that well. And it's sort of obviously US-centric story, but everybody's playing baseball now, right? So, but it's really interesting how the good pitchers and the good batters have to have every layer tuned up just right, and there are really big surprises in how that's done. It's not at all like, at least that I thought it would have been done. And of course, you have tool use. So what we have here is we have this acceleration of evolvability. And for us, right, what's our most source of flexibility? Well, we can get memes from other people. We don't have to think of everything, right? Of course, some of us, like Paul. Paul has his own ideas, right?
And they're all true.
And they're all true, right? But the rest of us have to get our ideas from Paul, right? Because this is just DAC plus some math, right? Also, we do horizontal tool transfer, right? We don't make all our own tools. So, okay, so what you see is this incredible diversity, pretty big diversity, none, right? So where are we most alike? Not in our tool use, not in the ideas we have, but probably mostly in these subcortical regions that are the equivalent of the OS, and I have no idea how that works, okay? So what we see is this common pattern, incredible diversity, not. Transcription, translation, same in every cell on the planet, right? Not the proteins, the protocol. OSs, a handful of those. And our subcortical, I don't know what the OS is in the brain, right? I'm asking you, okay? Super evolvable, pretty evolvable, not evolvable. How long? This stuff, you don't change this stuff. You don't change the OS, you don't change transcriptional tracing, you don't change this so much, right? You elaborate cortex, right? What's the biggest problem with this architecture? If you can swap genes, so can viruses. Viruses can swap you. So you intrinsically create a vulnerable architecture, right? Predators don't care about the architecture, they just want the meat, right? But parasites hijack the architecture, right? They're hijacking the whole architecture. And some of them do them really cool, like these zombie parasites. There's this, I forget what the name of this is. Somebody probably knows it. What's the name? Toxoplasmosis is it's called. Yeah, okay. So the life cycle, long story short, the life cycle requires the mouse, requires the organism to get into a cat. But it's in a mouse. So what does it do? It hijacks the brain of the mouse to make it attracted to cats as opposed to repel to cats. That very quickly gets the mouse inside the gut of the cat. And therefore, and so that's a life cycle. Read about that, it's so cool. It also has weird effects on humans. It has really weird effects, but it's very subtly hijacking the whole architecture, mostly leaving it intact. The mouse is otherwise unimpaired, it appears to be. but it suddenly has this bit flipped. And the nice thing is, it's cool, you got this mechanism to be afraid of cats, you just go. So think about, self-driving cars. It's got this thing, don't hit people. And now you got this killer robot, and you got 100 million of them around, right? So we better fix that security issue before it happens, right? And there's so many zombie parasites, it's unbelievable. The ones on ants are the most interesting because they're not parasites on individual ants, there's lots of those, but there's parasites on whole colonies that are just amazing. And every attack you can imagine on an ant colony, there's somebody who does it. It's just amazing. The parasites rule. And there's like 10 to the 32 bacteria in the ocean. Half of them are killed every day by viruses, which are called phage bacteria. Half. Who decides half? I'm guessing it's the phage, right? They don't want to kill too many. So who rules the world? Phage. And then you have sometimes, so predator and parasite, but there's some, right? This is a predator and a parasite hijacked. So it's a really interesting combination where the parasite has hijacked the predator in a specific way to transmit itself. So there's all sorts of cool things like that. So what's our biggest problem? Bad meme transfer. So the biggest problem humans have by far is we believe things that are false, unhealthy, and dangerous. And it seems like we're getting better at that, right? It's scary, right? And there's layers within layers. So I've talked about it as if there's 2 or 3 layers. There's layers within layers within layers. So here's the bottom line, is you got this hourglass architecture, diversity and evolvability, not quite as much. Not, right? So here's sort of your OS, lots of apps, lots of hardware. I like this phrase, constraints that deconstrain. That's a Gerhardt and Kirchner line. That's from biology. I really like that. It's interesting, there's digital everywhere. All these systems make massive use of digital technologies. Again, they're vastly more different than they are similar, but these universals that I've just pointed out are really profound. Okay, let me try to wrap up here. Okay, so these, like I said, what do they share in common? They have these speed flexibility trade-offs in their control systems. They have massive evolvability. That evolvability is created by this hourglass diversity. Horizontal transfer, all of these systems use horizontal transfer. Of course, that's why I picked them. They're tunable to create the illusion that the system as a whole is fast and flexible, even though no parts are. They're all, and I haven't spent as much time on this as I should, but it's all virtual and internal. When people, so one of the reasons I think that the issue of consciousness is a little overrated is, you know how many bits we have? I mean, what I've been told, and I've tried to do the experiments myself to go, oh no, that can't be true. Let me try, oh shit. And you try another experiment. We only got like 40 bits a second conscious thought. Maybe 100 if you're really awesome. Like, that's nothing. So the question is, what are we trying to explain? Anything you're good at, you're doing unconsciously and automatically. So all you have the choice to do is what you get good at. So I don't know, I think maybe we're asking the wrong question, but I haven't gotten to that yet, so I'm quite naive. But the stuff this morning was really cool. So this is a lot simpler. So hijacking is the big problem here. It gets worse as we get more advanced. The more sophisticated we get, the more enlightened we get, the better our weapons are. The other side is more powerful, has better weapons. Everybody's getting nukes now. So we're in this constant arms race, and we've got to find a way out of it. Everything's digital, a lot of digital. Robustness is the big issue all throughout here. So if you go, so these are the ones that I focus most of my attention on in my own research, but I'm interested in a lot of the others. So one of the things interesting is a lot of our technologies, now I'm conflating a whole bunch of things that are actually distinct, but are the creation of new wastes. What that does is it creates these. So think about what happens when we have this kind of, well, because you got these funny wall plugs. But there's only a few wall plugs, right? But there's a huge variety of things that we can plug into the wall. There's a huge bunch of ways we can make that, right? So that's really a bow tie, not an hourglass, but I won't belabor that too much. But always, think about container ships, right? Think of all these guys. Every one of them did something like this. They created a new waste that sat on top of everything else. They came in and slapped themselves on top of everything. This, like WeChat is this amazing thing. But anyway, and then what happens is you virtualize everything below you. You virtualize the whole internet. You virtualize all the news sources, right? And of course, then they're turned into commodities. The prices are driven to zero and they're gone. And that's what all these companies are doing. Some of them are funding me. So I have to be a little careful what I say about them. I don't want to say that they're evil. I'm just saying that they're exploiting the architecture we've given them, as are our politicians, as are our bankers. And we need to think about these kinds of architectures need different kinds of social organizations than we have. And I think the bonobos are a better way to run this than the chimps. And I can elaborate on that if you want. Or the elephants or the orcas, but not the chimps. We're chimps with guns and tech. And chimps with guns is a bad mix. You don't want to give chimps guns. And nukes, you don't want to give chimps nukes. They go, ooh, boom, right? Okay, so this is a big problem, right? I talked about it. Okay, so this is probably a good place to stop. But the idea is that this idea of virtualization, I didn't talk about it enough, but it's the way we should think about the unconscious and automatic parts of us. And not as abstractions. I think it's the precise term, which is that we take all of this resources, all these hardware resources, and we create an interface to them so that we get their function, but we don't see the details. We do that with memory, we do that with computing, we do that with our bodies, right? So when I go to take a drink, first of all, I can decide to get a drink, and that's it. That's all I'm doing consciously. Everything else, all the plan, that whole plan, that's not conscious. But it's done in a task space. And then a layer below that, it's actually turned into muscle motions. And then all this stuff about gripping, that's all done in a completely another layer down below. This is all completely automatic. And I can choose to get good at it or bad, but almost everything is automatic. And think about what we're doing with language, right? All automatic and unconscious. There's this little thin veneer of ideas that's going back and forth. But that's, again, 40 bits a second. So anyway, I think there are these universal architectures. We for the first time really have a theory that starts explaining all of it. And we want to forward engineer the next generation internet. That's not as interesting as it sounds. The bigger issues are really these. We don't have a coherent theory of predators and parasites. That's a way of thinking about it. We don't deal with predators and parasites in an integrated very, very well, and biology doesn't either. We have separate mechanisms there. So there's not, as yet, a biomimetic insights about how to deal with parasites and predators in an integrated way. And that's going to be a big nightmare for us, I think, going forward. So, okay, I think we've got us back on time.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, fantastic. All right, so do I have questions to John? So, but the point is indeed that the 40 bits per second that would be conscious, that's just willing yourself into the future, right? That's its role. It's like an error correction mechanism.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's high-level planning where you have a lot of time, but the most effective thing you can do with those 40 bits is decide what your virtual capabilities are going to be.
That's right.
Do you want to become a mathematician? Do you want to become an athlete? Do you want to be able to throw a 90-mile-an-hour fastball? Whatever. All those things, you make those choices. Yeah. So I think the point is those 40 bits are powerful because they're powerful because they're sitting on this massive virtualized infrastructure. Tony.
Yeah, it's a great talk. I think there are alternative brain architectures, but you have to look across very different phyla. So you have to look at insects,
hydras,
cephalopods.
Hydras are my new favorite thing. Yeah.
And then the interesting thing is to look for the convergence. So there is going to be elements of that architecture, but with vertebrates, it all gets it's been sealed before. 400 million years ago, we have the same basic brain architecture that you've alluded to, with some plasticity in the higher levels, particularly some plasticity on the periphery, of course, because the periphery changes, but the core system is fixed.
Yeah.
And
I need to learn more about that. And
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to your talk next week if that's
Okay, yeah, I can put some of that in there. Yeah, that would be a good idea. So I think that, and the same thing's happened with computers, is that we have had a competition for architectures, and as you say, we're converging on Linux, not as the optimal architecture, but as the best of the ones that we tried. And it's now difficult to start again and move to something new. There's an interesting idea.
That's the other thing I didn't say about this, is that these things create these winner-take-all, these changes in architecture where you create a new waste, where you bring in a new operating system, you bring in a new search technology, you bring in a new social network. They end up being winner-take-all because there's very strong pressure to have a thin waste. And so what ends up happening is that choice is often historical and not principled. It's an accident of it's the most accident of history. It's weird because it's under the most selective pressure. So if you look at that whole thing, the most selective pressure is on that part because everything else you can swap. Yet it's the most historically contingent, which I'm not even sure how to think about that. It kind of freaks me out, but we need to think about that. That's another trade-off that these architectures force us into.
Yeah, I agree, and it's, having some general theory of how these bottlenecks can happen is going to be really useful.
Yeah.
The other one that is kind of in biology, maybe not so much in technology, is sort of developmental bottlenecks. So I don't know if you know Rudolf Raff, his book, The Shape of Life.
Phylotypic stage.
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
Love that. No, that's,
Yeah.
there's development, so development I think is one of the really cool places to think about this in a more systematic way. And so constraints and deconstraint. That constraints and deconstraint, that phrase came from developmental biology. That was Gerhardt and Kirchner. So,
Like Hox genes, the genes that
yeah.
Leigh was pointing to, right?
Exactly. Exactly. So development is a spectacular case study in constraints that deconstrain, and that's where those words came from. So and the problem with this, I kind of rattle around. So but the reason I focus on these three case studies is they're kind of extremes. Bacteria in one end, technology in the other, and our brains in the other. I think intermediately you'll get a lot of interesting stories too.
So John,
But one thing, let me say one thing. But when I say architecture, I didn't put any, there's no topology here, right? It's layering. And there isn't a topology that goes with this because the application layer topology, the topology of your email accounts or Facebook or whatever, are completely separate from the topology of the underlying hardware. And that's the point of virtualization, so that when you send an email, you know somebody's name, but you don't need to know their address. You don't need to know where they are. The architecture takes care of that for you. That virtualization is really crucial. So systems that look really different superficially often have the same layered architecture over and over again. And I think the fact that bacteria in our brains have these shared features is really striking. Yeah.
Thanks very much for your talk. My question goes back to one of the earlier slides where you were talking about the diameter of the axons in different nerves and
Well, the axons are about the same. It's the diameter of the nerves.
number.
The number of the nerves, yeah.
I don't know if we can just refine that slide, but my question was from a fairly naive point of view, thinking of the nervous system as an information processor or information transmitter. And
I think that's not a good way to think about the nervous system.
I'm sure you don't.
I mean, that's a traditional way to think about it, right?
It's a traditional way to think about it. I'm going to temporarily become a quite traditional.
Because it's not like the phone system. It's definitely not the phone system. It's much more a cyber-physical system.
What I'm remembering is
Okay.
a little slide which said 7 bits and something else which had just 2 or 3 bits.
Let me find that.
Bottom left.
I know what you mean. Okay, I'm getting there, right?
It's quite soon. It's quite soon.
Yeah.
It's within the next 3 or 4 slides.
Yep. This next one coming up. Yeah.
That's it. Yeah.
So the low delay versus high bandwidth.
So what you seem to have in the bottom right is you have a number, you have 7 individual neurons.
No, 7 axons.
Axons.
Within one nerve.
Right.
Yeah, you're right. 7 individual neurons, yeah.
What one might want to say in terms of the organization of the brain-body interface is that those 7 axons might all have different receptive fields. So, for example, they
Oh,
might
yeah.
receive inputs from different regions
Yep.
on the skin.
Yep.
So
They do.
They do, right.
Right. And the same with the optic nerve, and the same with the
Right. So there's topography, there's
Yep.
mapping.
Yep.
There are receptor surfaces, there
Yep.
are receptor sheets.
Yep.
And what this really means is that those are all messages about a different thing.
Yep.
So they might be messages about whether a mosquito has stung me, has bit me on 7 different parts of my body.
Yep.
And I missed very much in your description of the nervous system this idea of aboutness. You know, what is this neural message about? So you described its speed and you described its quantization error, but you didn't engage, I think, with this sort of information processing idea that one of the functions of the nervous system is to transmit information from a sender to a receiver. And
Yeah.
there's a question about what is the content of this information, what it's about, what is it about, which part of my receptor surface does it refer to? So this is a way of expressing the point that more generally you didn't engage with what's called intentionality, the idea that that the nervous system passes information about specific events.
Yeah, so let me just say a couple things about that. The problem is information has come to be this overloaded word that means it's antonym, right? So when I say a message is informative, or first of all, it has to be meaningful. Now, Shannon, one of my heroes, said, "Oh, let's get rid of that. Let's ignore meaning." And then the next thing I would say, "Okay, it's got to be timely. If you don't get it to me on time, it doesn't matter anything." Oh, Shannon goes, "Let's get rid of that." And they're just going, like, what's left? And Shannon had this brilliant idea. There is something left, and it's just surprise. And he built information theory all around surprise without delay and without meaning. Now, the reason, and information theory has dominated neuroscience, and it's unfortunate because it's not the phone system. Delay matters, and meaning matters. So I have a whole talk on this that I haven't put in the video. So let me kind of give you, but you can talk about language as having, this is the hardware layer story. And I finessed the meaning story by saying that there's kind of 2 high-level tasks. There's this planning, following the trail, and there's a dealing with the bumps. And these are 2 separate high-level activities. I did that so I could do high school math. Now, you're absolutely right that meaning is layered too. So you have meaning, more or less meaning sitting, oh wow. Anyway, you have meaning at the top layer. So meaning is the top layer, and there's enormous diversity in meaning. And then there's the physical layer, which is less diverse, but still fairly diverse. But then there's a middle layer, which in this context is syntax. And so I'm mostly talking about, I wanted to connect the hardware layer and its diversity of this type with a functional layer and its diversity. And that functional layer had a little meaning in it, but not much. You're right, it's too stripped down. But it has a little bit of it. It has vision. I have the vision modality and planning, and then I have the reflex proprioception part of it. But admittedly, it's stripped down, it's stripped bare, it's very minimal. And I totally agree with that.
In some sense, also another trade-off, because that bit, right, let's say the quantization error or delay of that 1 bit is again modulated on what it signifies.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, there's another thing I didn't talk about, which is one of the most interesting things of all. In all these sensing systems, you have 10 times as many wires going out to the sensor as coming back, right? Except from LGN to the retina, which is probably just a bug because we evolved from those little shrews that couldn't see anything. So we have vestigial vision. Because birds have tons of feedback out to the retina, and they have better vision with less hardware, right? So, but in any case, in hearing everywhere, you see tons of feedback. And so one thing I didn't talk about is the theory, the graduate level theory stuff does suggest why you'd want to do that. And you already know the answer because if you're asking in neuroscience, why is all that feedback there? Because this path has got to be fast. So what you do is, this path has got to be fast. Mostly the sensory environment isn't changing at all. And when it does change, like growl, you want to have a really fast path for a few bits. So what you do is you send a few bits this way. You send a lot of bits this way. And what these bits are saying is, this is what I expect to see. And this is duck, right? That's what the theory says. That sounds like what's going on. But these are all additional features that are where we finessed here. But the theory more or less lets you say why it should be that way. Now we have to think about what experiments are we going to do that would check whether that's true or not.
Yeah, this is a bit too abstract to think of specific experiments. It's a framework rather than anything directly.
Yeah. So we had this one experiment, So I'm now, the next step is, there's kind of two directions we're going with this, which is I'm working with Terry Sejnowski to try to think about what do we do next with this. And then the other thing we're looking at is putting my kind of now two favorite things together, the microbiome and the brain and how those work together. So now I can do bacteria and brains. And ecosystems are really interesting because ecosystems also have architectures. I've mostly studied wildfire ecosystems because wildfires are popular in California. And they're, again, fascinating story about the architecture of those ecosystems and how we're really messing them up. And we're also really probably messing this one up too. But I'm just getting started on the microbiome. And it looks like, the colleagues I'm working with who do the experiments, it looks like total science fiction to me. I go, that can't possibly be right. No, here's the data. And you go, that's impossible. All you did is change the bacteria in the gut of this mouse, and the behavior completely changes. How can that be? Anyway, so there's so many architecture stories to be looked at here. So again, like I said, I really kept it simple so that the underlying math is simple. But I think it's now the right way to think about DAC, the right way to think about these things. Again, I'm more convinced about bacteria because I understand them a lot better than I am about brains, because I don't know what the OS is. I know what the OS is in this. I know what the OS is in bacteria. It's in the brain. So that's a big question. What's the OS? Anyway.
Okay.
So my question would be, I don't know if that's valid for every system, but at least thinking about the brain, we tend to think that higher level processes tend to be more serial, while you go down to the architecture to reflexes. And to motor control, you have more parallel processes, right? And I think that one of the big issues here is how do you interface serial and parallel processes? So I was wondering if you take into account these into your architecture and how you solve that problem. If that's a problem that you see also in other systems, or it's something that is typical of say brain architecture.
I'll put it a little differently, which is, I think serial is a special case of the higher level stuff. The higher level stuff is localized in a particular way. So I can localize things by having them be localized in time, and that's serial. Or I can have them localized in a kind of a functional space. So for example, email versus Facebook. Okay. So those are both mechanisms of localization at the level of function. And there's lots of others we could list. Localization of function, okay? Now, parallelism is another special case of localization at the hardware layer.
Okay.
So at the hardware layer, there's all sorts of localizations. And the functional localization and the hardware localization typically have very little to do with each other.
Okay.
And the whole point of having an operating system is the operating system virtualizes all those mechanisms down below, which have their own locality, and make them look global.
I see.
And they make them look global in order that you can then slap on any old locality you have on the top end. Now, the reason you want locality up here is because you don't want things bumping into each other. So you don't want your email and your Facebook and all these other things mixing too much. You want to have controlled mixing. You don't want to have willy-nilly mixing of stuff. So you don't want to have stuff just flying all over the place, right? You want to be able to right? So you want to have locality up here, and it doesn't match here, but you virtualize all this so that you can create this locality on top of this mismatched locality.
Okay.
And that's what that's arguably, so serial and parallel is a very, very special kind of locality.
Okay. But then you need to deal with a lot of compression in the middle, right? Is that true? I'm still thinking about the brain, how you interface the cortex now with the body, for example.
Well, I think the thin waist...
Convergent pathways.
No, but I don't think this thin waist means it shouldn't be thought of as compression in the information theory sense.
Okay.
It's compression in the diversity sense. If you looked at it in another sense, there might be more bandwidth and stuff in this middle than there is at the top or the bottom,
oh, I see.
right? this is a diversity waste. It's not a, again, these are cartoons and they're going by way too fast and they're overloaded and stuff. But I do think serial and parallel is one of the most important differences between this layer. But there's some serial stuff going on down here as well, right? It's that there is serial locality going down here and there's parallel locality going on up here, but it's really locality, virtualization that I think is the big idea to keep in mind. And I think that's true in brains. I know it's true in bacteria. I know it's true in the internet.
Yeah, so virtualization is really a key concept here.
Key concept,
and that's
yeah.
what the architecture
And I
is.
think the reason I use virtualization and not abstraction is because abstraction already means too many things. So this whole story is an abstraction, right? So I think I think virtualization is a precise term, and it's a term that people do use in engineering, and I think it's a good use of that term.
Yeah, and also in that sense, linking it to consciousness. So I've been proposing that we can think about consciousness as a virtualization memory of the agent.
Yeah, so I think it's so when I hear people talk about there's no free will, blah, blah, all this stuff, I don't even know how to think about the conversation because I think you need to think about it in the context of a massively virtualized system. And then what does free will and what does that stuff even mean in the context of a massively virtualized system? And how much consciousness does a bacteria have? I mean, so I think it has a bit per second and we have 40. But it's not otherwise, I don't know how different it is, right? It goes out and swaps genes to get new capabilities that it now has to implement in an automatic and unconscious fashion. That's what we do. I mean,
No, but John, can we get more precise on
Yeah.
virtualization? Because you could argue, as soon as I quantize, so I start to move away from the raw signal, right? Plus, I have to overcome a delay. That means I have to start to rely on memory.
yeah.
That's my first step towards virtualization.
Yeah,
a
yeah,
necessity.
yeah. I think that's certainly an important step. Yeah,
So can we define the core parameters of that virtualization more precisely, and also map it to the architecture you propose of the bump trail task?
I think we can. The problem is I think the details are really, really different in the 3 case studies I'm looking at.
Right.
Yeah, really, really different. So, but we should. It's getting late.
All right, we're not only virtual, we're also physical, and we need to feed the beast.
Microbiome needs to be
Exactly, the microbiome has to be made happy. So, John, thank you very much for fantastic talk.